Today we're talking about the Constitution, and obviously it's a gigantic topic, so the way I've chosen to handle it is to really direct our attention to four areas of the Constitution that have been the source of quite a bit of controversy over the years. I mean, these three are the areas that are the most contested, but I add the war powers issue because it's of current day relevance and because it came up last week and I pledged that I would say something about it. So I want to cover these four things in this order. Without really giving too much background into the Constitutional Convention and the view that the previous document, the Articles of Confederation, had certain difficulties and shortcomings. That may be common knowledge, maybe not. It's briefly discussed in my book, but what I'm doing, as I say, is mainly trying to focus our discussion on specific things rather than trying to do a sweeping overview of everything. So I'm going to take for granted that you sort of followed the discussion up to this point, that as of 1787 there is a U.S. Constitution drafted, and that document is then submitted to the states to be ratified, and by 1788 the requisite 9 states have done so, and by 1790 all the original 13 states have ratified it. But as I say, I want to focus on 4 clauses in particular whose interpretation has been the source of controversy and continues to be the source of controversy. Every time there's a proposed or a nominee to the Supreme Court, everybody wants to know where does he stand on these particular clauses. Particularly the Commerce Clause. That's the one that comes up most often when somebody's being confirmed to the Supreme Court. What's your view of the Commerce Clause? And you wind up getting into fairly technical discussions. Well, let's start with this issue of war powers, and particularly the question of how are the powers involved in the prosecution of war apportioned among the Congress as versus the President. Now, what I suggest in my little section on this, which is at the end of my Constitution chapter, is that the President does not actually have, under the Constitution, the kind of expansive powers that it's taken for granted today that he has, that he was not intended to have these powers. Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution refers to the President as the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. But we need to understand what that means. What does it mean for him to be the Commander-in-Chief? Well, as I indicated briefly last time, what that meant is that the President directs a war once it has been declared. This is because of the inconvenience of having hundreds of congressmen trying to pick out targets. Could you imagine how that would go? So the idea is that we need to have this responsibility, in effect, monopolized by the executive branch. But that's once the war has been declared. It does not mean the President himself has the power to declare war, because Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution declares that the Congress has the power to declare war. Now, I also indicated very briefly last time that the framers of the Constitution distinguished between a power to declare war and a power to make war. The President is deprived of the power to declare war. That power is reposed in the Congress. But he is not strictly deprived under the Constitution of the power to make war. And what's meant by that is that if there were some sudden surprise attack on a United States territory, the President could repel that attack immediately without consulting the Congress. But in terms of initiating a war, under any other types of circumstances, the President would have to go to Congress for a declaration of war. And it's interesting to note, by the way, of course, that in the case of World War II, where there actually was an attack on American territory, when there was that attack on Pearl Harbor, even in that case, President Roosevelt went to Congress looking for a declaration of war, since he was not interested in simply repelling the one attack. He wanted to actually go on the offensive and declare a full-scale war. So he got the consent of Congress for that. Well, you'll note in my book, so I don't want to repeat myself too much, just how few powers related to foreign policy the President was given on his own. A lot of the powers are given to Congress or are given to Congress and the President jointly. But in terms of powers that are granted to the President exclusively, we see only 2 relating to foreign affairs, his being Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, as we've already seen, and the power to receive ambassadors, which is not a particularly glamorous power. And I also note in the Constitution chapter that the framers of the Constitution explicitly noted that they had no desire to model the American government on the British one. And they pointed out that in the case of the British government, the monarch had the power to declare war. And we don't believe that that is a good model on which to base a free society. James Madison, who is sometimes rightly or wrongly called the father of the Constitution, wrote to Thomas Jefferson as follows. He said, "The Constitution supposes what the history of all governments demonstrates, that the executive is the branch of power most interested in war and most prone to it. It has accordingly, with studied care, vested the question of war in the legislature." Elsewhere, Madison remarked, "It has grown into an axiom that the executive is the department of power most distinguished by its propensity to war. Hence, it is the practice of all states, in proportion as they are free, to disarm this propensity of its influence." At the Constitutional Convention itself, as the document was being drafted, Pierce Butler was for vesting the power to declare war in the president, who he said will have all the requisite qualities and will not make war except when the nation will support it. That motion did not even receive a second. At the Pennsylvania Ratifying Convention, James Wilson assured the delegates as follows, that this system will not hurry us into war. It is calculated to guard against it. It will not be in the power of a single man or a single body of men to involve us in such distress, for the important power of declaring war is vested in the legislature at large. This declaration must be made with the concurrence of the House of Representatives. From this circumstance we may draw a certain conclusion that nothing but our interest can draw us into war. Alexander Hamilton, writing in the Federalist Papers, which were written to persuade, as a series of articles to persuade New York to ratify, Hamilton explained that the President's authority would be nominally the same with that of the King of Great Britain, but in substance much inferior to it. It would amount to nothing more than the supreme command and direction of the military and naval forces as First General and Admiral of the Confederacy, while that of the British King extends to the declaring of war and to the raising and regulating of fleets and armies, all which by the Constitution under consideration would appertain to the legislature. And finally, Abraham Lincoln, who obviously was not at the Constitutional Convention, but nevertheless made an interesting observation about what Article 2, Section 2 should mean. Lincoln said this, "Allow the President to invade a neighboring nation whenever he shall deem it necessary to repel an invasion, and you allow him to do so whenever he may choose to say he deems it necessary for such purpose, and you allow him to make war at pleasure. Study to see if you can fix any limit to his power in this respect after you have given him so much as you propose. If today he should choose to say he thinks it necessary to invade Canada to prevent the British from invading us, how could you stop him? You may say to him, 'I see no probability of the British invading us,' but he will say to you, 'Be silent, I see it if you don't.'" The provision of the Constitution, this is still Lincoln, giving the war-making power to Congress was dictated, as I understand it, by the following reasons. Kings had always been involving and impoverishing their people in wars, pretending generally, if not always, that the good of the people was the object. This our convention understood to be the most oppressive of all kingly oppressions, and they resolved to so frame the Constitution that no one man should hold the power of bringing this oppression upon us. But your view, he's speaking with an antagonist, destroys the whole matter and places our president where kings have always stood. John Bassett Moore was a great authority on international law, who among other credentials occupied the first professorship of international law at Columbia University. And he said, in the early 20th century, "There can hardly be room for doubt that the framers of the Constitution, when they vested in Congress the power to declare war, never imagined that they were leaving it to the executive to use the military and naval forces of the United States all over the world for the purpose of actually coercing other nations, occupying their territory, and killing their soldiers and citizens, all